Off we go with the review video for exam 2. In this exam, there are 5 chapters and still 40 multiple choice questions. Again, about 30 of them that I've extracted from the question bank that you've been seeing all along, and about 10 that I've written based on things I've emphasized in the classroom and classroom discussions. So let's dive in. First, we'll start with chapter 5, which is about competitive rivalry. There's a question that plumbs into this idea of resource similarity and market commonality and how that drives things. Also, there are questions about first mover benefits and likelihood of response and likelihood of attack. It's not on the chart, but the question is about multi-market contact, so pay particular attention to multi-market contact when you read the chapter. Make sure you understand the difference between tactical attacks and strategic attacks and the responses to both. Everything on this chart is going to be helpful. There's about 2 questions that talk about competitive tendencies, and knowing everything here tends to help you be able to sort out the answers to those questions. There is a question about first versus second mover, and really it's based on what the textbook had to say more so than what I said in the lecture, so make sure you review the textbook and first and second mover. Really nothing about the market speeds, nothing about that. There is a question that you would be able to get even if you didn't really understand this description, but just being familiar with these terms and what they generally mean will help you. And that's really it for chapter 5. For chapter 6, remember, I'm not going to test you on any of these percentages, but the concept of low versus high level diversification and knowing that high level diversification would be considered an unrelated diversification, understanding the concept is going to be important to you. Understanding these 2 concepts is going to be extremely important, which really it all revolves around synergy, or why are these things better together. The first is just remember that the reason that 2 things should be combined in a diversification strategy is that they're worth more together than they would be separately. And then that's that magic word synergy. 1 + 1 = 3, which is that embodiment of that same concept. And we will ask a question about Pirate's Treasure, so make sure that you remember how I explain synergy in that vein. Understanding this slide is going to be helpful. There's no direct question on it, but it's going to help you sort through the application questions. Understanding what is and what is not economies of scope is a test question, so be ready for that. And all of these things helped explain the concepts, but they're not, they were not on the exam. In vertical integration, remember there are 2 types. There's backward integration, where a company goes back and buys its supplier. That would be when Tiffany bought the diamond mines. And then you could also have forward integration, where you go and you buy a buyer. And this would be, let's say, if a diamond miner bought Tiffany's, that would be an example of forward integration. Unrelated diversification, there's a question on recognizing what is unrelated diversification, so make sure you understand that. Nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. That's it for chapter 6. For chapter 7, mergers and acquisitions, you're going to start off by knowing the definition of a merger and being able to explain why mergers are relatively infrequent. Nothing on this slide. It is very important that you understand the fundamental differences between a consolidation, an extension, and an entrepreneurship M&A. And within those, there are some key concepts. Downsizing, understand, or make sure you understand what the concept of downsizing is when a company does a consolidation M&A. In terms of extensions, be sure that you remember that typically when it comes to product development, this is seen as a lower risk and a lower cost way to add similar products. And it also tends to be faster, and that's simply because buying something that's already proven, whether it's a product or moving into a geographic market, is seen as faster, cheaper, less risk than trying to develop it organically. Nothing in particular off of here. Make sure that you understand these steps and specifically understand the concept of due diligence. And then what doesn't go well. In terms of the wrong price and overpay. There's a question there that talks about, excuse me, high debt levels, and that a company that has to take on more money afterwards. And that's just a key word to show that they probably overpaid or paid an excessive acquisition premium. But all of these concepts are important because why don't they go well? And then by flipping around, why do they go well? Same thing here. And then we get into the restructuring. There is a question on restructuring, and specifically it's an application question that talks about what kind of firm is likely to be most effectively restructured. And so if you think about it, what would be the opposite of an M&A? What would have some ways that you would be able to downsize or downscope the firm? That would be a good way to approach that question. And next we'll get on to the idea of alliances. Well, I just said alliances, but what the bald guy meant to say was, let's talk about international. So chapter 8, just as a reminder, the basic benefits are you get to sell more or you get to make it cheaper. And those are the two basic concepts that you're looking for. You should be familiar with each of these three strategies, which are the next slide. So make sure you know the term and the principles behind them. Understanding these three strategies will give you the answer to most of the questions because they're all evolving around what's the difference between the various strategies and what are the keys to the strategies. And just rereading these sections and paying attention to the words on the slides are going to be particularly helpful for you here. There is a specific question on the idea of when to concentrate versus distribute manufacturing, so make sure that you have paid attention to that as well. There are no questions about franchising and licensing. What you're going to see is more questions. They're going to ask you to interpret what's good or bad about exporting, greenfield venture, or a wholly owned subsidiary, buying into or forming a strategic alliance in a country. So don't worry about these two, but make sure you reread the sections in the books on these four concepts because that's going to give you a couple of questions. Understand what it means to suffer from the liability of foreignness and be able to spot that, particularly in the cultural realm. And then make sure you understand the idea of currency rate fluctuations and be sure you can answer, you know the answer to this question in terms of what does the strength of a home currency do to businesses that are manufacturing, I'm sorry, not manufacturing, exporting goods. That's it. And then we have one last chapter, and that is alliances. Last chapter, alliances. Make sure you understand the difference between these three types of alliances. Also know what type of knowledge is best shared through a joint venture. I don't want to say there's anything particular on this slide, but one of the things is going to be to understand economies of scale and economies of scope and how it can be applied in alliances and how it can motivate the alliances. So make sure you're up on both those words and you won't have any trouble applying them. Also make sure you understand the difference between a vertical alliance and a horizontal alliance, and then understand why horizontal alliances tend to be a little bit more fragile, which we talked about in class. Like I said, don't study these pages for the exam. There's really nothing on cross-border alliances either. There are several test questions on what makes or breaks alliances, so pay particular attention to this chart and make sure you understand conflict and opportunistic behavior. And likewise, this chart, there is a question about cost minimization versus opportunity maximization. So make sure you're familiar with both of those types of contracts. Reading the chapter is going to be the best way to review that. Make sure you remember that trust, respect, and transparency that is verified and verifiable is the key. And so there's some interesting things that happen here. And then also remember what tends to make the most successful alliances on this point. I don't think there's a direct test question off of this chart, but this is a good thing to keep in mind. And there are no questions about the 787 specifically. Well, actually, let me back off on that. We illustrated in class a very important point of the benefits of the alliance are what we've been talking about, but we don't talk about sometimes what's key is the loss of control and visibility. So I think that is a test question. I'm glad I didn't go too fast on that. So again, to recap, you'll have 60 minutes. You will be able to start early that morning at 7:30. That way you can get done earlier and be ready to have more time for Globus. It'll be 40 questions, all multiple choice. Good luck.